So, Kirk, we're going to turn it over to you for some opening comments and go from there.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I'm really excited to be here and to be joined by you all and looking forward to this conversation. And today we are talking about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a seminal declaration of American foreign policy, and it's shaped American foreign policy really since it was declared on December 2nd, 1823 by James Monroe. To fully appreciate the doctrine, I think it's important to think about it in sort of three phases. What is it? Why is it given? Why was it given its historical context? And then what has it meant for American foreign policy since it was delivered? So the Monroe Doctrine was a national security declaration that stated that the Western Hemisphere was a sphere of interest for the United States. Countries make these claims to define their zones of interest, meaning they want to make clear to other countries what matters to them, what they perceive as threats, and what actions might bring them into conflict with other nations. The Monroe Doctrine was made by President James Monroe in his annual address to Congress, which is what we now call the State of the Union Address, on December 2nd, 1823, over 200 years ago. And in it, he declared that the Western Hemisphere was henceforth not to be considered for colonization by European powers, that the United States would consider any European intervention in the Western Hemisphere to be dangerous to our peace and safety, and that they would decide to respond, the United States, they would decide to respond accordingly, depending on the circumstances of whatever intervention was taking place. And in return, the United States pledged to not interfere in European wars or in European internal affairs. This was a ringing statement of both American continental aspirations and of American Republican ideals against old world monarchical ideals. So that's what it is in a nutshell, but why it was given involves looking at both European and American history. As the United States expanded westward after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, it contended with several of these powerful European nations on American soil: Spain in Florida, Great Britain in Canada, and Russia in the Pacific Northwest. All of these European powers stood as possible threats to American continental expansion under the ideal of manifest destiny, which saw a desire for the United States to have a nation that stretched from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. In addition, after the end of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, following the Battle of Waterloo, European nations sought to reinforce monarchical principles and preserve their colonial possessions in the Western Hemisphere. In the early 1800s, several countries rebelled against the Spanish Empire, and the United States had to decide how it would recognize those new countries and respond to Spanish attempts to reassert its authority. In addition, claims by Russia in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1820s further threatened American possessions. The result was the assertion of American prerogatives in the Monroe Doctrine, stating again that America would see as its particular zone of interest anything going on in the Western Hemisphere. From 1823, the doctrine has shaped how Americans have responded to actions in the Western Hemisphere, but also how it's sort of worked to expand its own colonial or its own continental ambitions. Um, Many Latin American nations, when it was given originally, doubted whether or not the United States could even enforce it. The United States was a new country. We had only been formed, a couple decades beforehand. We did not have a strong standing army. We had just come out of the War of 1812 ourselves in 1815. And so whether or not the United States could enforce in 1823 any of the provisions that are outlined in the Monroe Doctrine itself was viewed with some skepticism. And in fact, early assertions by the Russians in 1821, which sort of helped bring about the Monroe Doctrine, were only sort of successfully pushed back because of intervention by the British Navy. So that tells you how kind of tenuous this whole thing was. Even after the declaration, it wasn't as though the United States began asserting itself against every European nation that came into the Western Hemisphere. In fact, in the 1820s, Spain sought to reassert its colonial possessions in Mexico, and the United States got involved in some naval campaigns but didn't send troops, and it was sort of challenging. Later in 1861, when the French, under Napoleon III, attempted to establish Archduke Maximilian on the throne and establish the Second Mexican Empire, the United States was unable to intervene because of the American Civil War, which was ongoing at the time. And so, although we cited the Monroe Doctrine, and that's actually where the phrase began to come from, was that 1861 moment, it wasn't really able to do much in order to push back against French intervention until after the war. And when the war was concluded, that led to more of a diplomatic resolution. Um, As the century progressed, Americans began to see this also as a way of projecting its own power sort of across the Western Hemisphere. So in 1870, it was cited by Ulysses S. Grant when he proposed annexing Santo Domingo, something that eventually did not go through because it failed in the Senate, but it was another sort of opportunity for us to project American power. And then later, during the Spanish-American War in 1898, it was certainly cited as we sought to push back against Spain, which began a long relationship with Cuba in the United States. And then obviously during the Cold War, again, citing that Cuba relationship in the Platt Amendment, there were a lot of guarantees in when it came to Cuba, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then later, during the 80s and the tail end of the Cold War, there were more pushback against different insurgencies in Latin American countries, again, citing the Monroe Doctrine as justification for why it is that the United States was involved. So that's sort of a high level look at sort of what the Monroe Doctrine is and sort of how we've gone about enforcing it at different moments. But the short version is, again, it is a doctrine that says that the United States sees the Western Hemisphere as being its own sphere of interest, and that anything that's taking place in the Western Hemisphere that's coming from outside of it, the United States begins to look at skeptically and believes that it begins to threaten American interests. So with that, Kathy, that I hope sets the stage for a good conversation.
Well, thank you. That is a great overview. And Janine, would you like me to go to you next or
Sure. Yeah. Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, we have the Monroe Doctrine, and it says, we claim that we are interested in our hemisphere over here, right? Um, but what does that mean? I mean, it's like they've come over anyway. Cuba came over. They took over Cuba. There are all kinds of dictatorships and things going on in South America and Mexico, and other countries have infiltrated. It doesn't really mean anything, does it? And did it even then? Because it's nice to get the State of the Union and say, you know what, we're really interested in in anyone who comes in we consider a threat. But explain to the students who are listening too, what were those dimensions when we say hemisphere? What exactly are we talking about? And it just seems to me like it hasn't really meant anything. A. And B, I know maybe we'll get into this in a little bit after Jim talks, but how does that correlate with what's happening today with, say, Venezuela and whatnot? But let's go back to that. Was a nice little speech, and we're calling it a doctrine, but has it really done anything? A. And B, A, talk about what the hemisphere, for our kids, the scope of
Sure.
it. And B, really, it hasn't done anything, really, has it?
Yeah, thanks, Janine. It's a great question. And it's an interesting thing when it comes to foreign policy. So, in other videos, I've talked about this, like having a dispute with my sibling when I was living in my parents' house. And I would say, oh, well, this is my room. Don't come in here. And it's not really my room in the first place. So a little bit different from the United States, but I don't really have any authority to tell her not to come in other than to complain loudly. That's kind of a bad metaphor. But the idea is you make these claims and you outline what's in your interest in order to force a response or at least force people to come and begin to have negotiations. So for the Western Hemisphere, it really stretched from Hawaii all the way through the Caribbean, if that's sort of a way of thinking about it. We've cited the Monroe Doctrine when it comes to different ongoing situations that are going on in Hawaii, and then it's both the North and South American continents. So everything sort of in our direct backyard is basically geographically.
Wait. Okay, say that again. Say that again. Okay, you said from Hawaii to the Caribbean,
Yep,
and then are you talking
from
Canada down to
Canada
South
down to
America?
down to Chile and Peru and Argentina. Yep,
Okay.
yep,
Well, what did that even mean and I'm just being devil's advocate. Okay.
sure.
Well, what did that even mean? I mean, because Canada was Canada and Mexico was Mexico, and you had all these other countries. I guess you were saying if Europe tries to
Yep,
come into these countries, but England was already pretty much Canada to begin with, right?
yep.
Great Britain. So it's not that, because I mean, we got this tricky little thing going on today with Trump and Venezuela, right? Everybody wants to compare it to the Monroe Doctrine, but I don't really see the comparison, because really we're just saying European nations don't come in and try to overtake these countries. Is that simply what it was?
Well, historically, I would say yes. I mean, historically, I think James Monroe would have been speaking directly to European nations who had colonial possessions here. So it wasn't as though when we made the colonial doctrine, we had eyes on invading Canada. We had just signed a peace treaty with Britain in 1823. And so it wasn't as though we were going to be extending power. However, we were saying that no new colonization should be happening. So no new interventions. And if there were new interventions, then the United States would respond in a way that they felt would protect their own safety and security. So that's not even saying that we were going to declare war, but it was saying that we have a special interest in determining what that action would mean. And it puts other nations on sort of guard that if you do that, you may run afoul of the United States. And so that's what the doctrine was setting up. Now, it has come to mean more over time as it's become less of a proclamation of neutrality and non-intervention and preservation, and more to be a means of projecting power in the Western Hemisphere as it being sort of a zone of interest. So that's not much of a less complicated way of saying it. I apologize, Ginny, but
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
no.
but the idea was, yeah, but it didn't, but the Monroe Doctrine didn't even guarantee that we were going to intervene in any of these other conflicts that were going on. It was, again, it was a statement to say the United States has a special interest in what's taking place in the Western Hemisphere. And if you come over and try to reassert your authority or try to put down these nations who were seeking to establish republics in South America in particular, then the United States would possibly take exception to that.
And the Cuban crisis would be an example of that.
Correct.
You know, and then if you go further down, though, I mean, it seems like if we were going to say that, then we should have stuck by it. It's like saying to a child, if we're going to do the kid metaphor, right?
Yep.
It's like, if you do this, you're gonna get time out, and then they do
Yeah.
it, and then they don't get time out. So the
Right.
kids are going to keep doing it because, like, that didn't really mean anything. And so if you look at the foreign influence that's been happening in South
Right.
America, especially, it looks like we've let that slide a lot. What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
I certainly think it's been selectively enforced, and I think it has to do again with the way that the United States or any particular administration would perceive the interests of the United States. And Jim, having worked for administrations, can probably speak to this better than I can. But I would say from a historical perspective, it's been dependent on what has been the direct interest of the United States. Um,
We have
I feel like
music.
I'm getting played off. It's like the Oscars. But but I think it has to do with what is in the particular economic interest, what's in the particular sort of geopolitical interest of the United States at various times, and that has what has led to whether or not we would intervene, which is the way that the statement reads. If you read it, it was carefully written by John Quincy Adams, delivered by Monroe. But to say, look, we're not saying we're going to intervene in any one of these conflicts, but we are saying be on your guard. If you intervene, it matters to the United States.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to pass and not hog all the time. Here, thank you. That was well done. Thank you.
Mary, we'll go to you.
Lovely. Well, I'm super excited to talk about this. Foreign policy is really cool to me. I spent my last year on it. I learned a lot about Central America, and I was talking to Mr. Higgins before the chat about that a little bit. And when I was reading about it, I was reading this book. It was called A Theory of Foreign Policy, because I think it's important to zoom out, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And it helps frame the Monroe Doctrine. The book it was based on a premise that foreign policy moves are made based off maintenance or change. And from what I'm hearing you talk about, what I was hearing was the Monroe Doctrine was one of those maintenance moves to keep things as they are in the Western Hemisphere, or attempts to. And I wanted to talk to you more about the theme of keeping our enemies out of our backyard. Can you speak more to that? Was that a maintenance move? Do you think it was a change move, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to frame foreign policy. I do think it was a means of the United States attempting to assert what it saw as its position as a power in the hemisphere at a time when it didn't have a lot of power. So not only because we were a new country, we had skeptical views of what it meant to maintain a standing army. We had a very small navy. We were not the world power that we would become. And so that's really important historical context. But what the Monroe Doctrine does is it says that that the United States is going to be is going to be clear in where its interests lay, which is in this hemisphere, that it wraps itself in sort of Republican versus monarchical language, I think, again, is reflective of the broader geopolitical situation that was taking place, particularly in Europe, with the Holy Alliance, which was between Prussia, Russia, and Austria, which is a group of monarchies who were trying to assert sort of the interests of absolute monarchies. Um, it also at points involved Great Britain and France. It broke down for various reasons, but the idea is that the United States was positioning itself as the power in this hemisphere, and that its intent was to, I think, establish as much as maintain. So establish itself as being that preeminent power, and it saw itself, I think, at least being somewhat ideologically in line with what several of the Latin American countries were attempting to do in rebelling against empire. So historically, we had rebelled against an empire, and so it had some sort of a connection there. But I think what it really is an aspirational statement that has become over time something that has been um, become more important as the United States has grown in its own power.
That's real. I didn't even think about that. So back then, it's a little America. I mean, in my mind, trying to be like, this is all ours,
Yeah.
trying to have the appearance of being like strong in the hemisphere to build its own strength. But now, obviously, times have changed, and that's what's something I wanted to talk to you about because obviously now the forces have changed. Europe's not as big of a threat to us as we would say as China or some other countries like that. Do we have a similar agreement with those countries? Because I know that especially in Latin America, China is very interested in the tech industry and it's trying to gain footing there, and that's a concern. So, do we have a similar agreement? Do we not? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so again, I would say this is where it's important to understand what the Monroe Doctrine was in 1823 and sort of what it's become. So what it was a statement sort of rooted in the historical context of the time. When it was made, I don't think it was as if James Monroe was thinking, well, in 200 odd years, we will then be able to do X, Y, and Z. So the way that it has evolved, it has become less Euro focused and more focused on any kind of intervention in the Western Hemisphere being something that is in the direct sphere of interest of the United States. So if a country is doing anything in the U.S., then that matters a good deal to us. So, and thinking about it as an agreement is even tricky because it's not a treaty. It's nothing more than a statement in a speech. It's just that the sentiment behind that statement has gained in significance over time, especially as in the later part of the 19th century, as the U.S. begins to have more sort of outward-looking interests. It has grown in significance. And I mean, it's even, we state in the Monroe Doctrine that we wouldn't involve ourselves in European affairs. We've obviously done that significantly twice in both First World War and the Second World War. So, it's not the words of the doctrine itself are important for the historical context. What it has become in the mind of in the way that it shapes American foreign policy is sort of a separate story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. And to that point, I'm wondering, a world without the Monroe Doctrine as we currently know it, what really would change to piggyback off Janine? Would anything change? Would the sentiment remain even if we didn't have the Monroe Doctrine? What do you believe there?
Yeah, I mean, it's as a historian, it's hard for me to play counterfactuals with history. I certainly think if the United States was going to grow as it was, and again, remember this was partly a continental expansion. I mean, we had purchased France from Louisiana, so we had interactions with the French. Spain was in Florida and had substantial influence in Mexico, so the Spanish Empire is right on our borders. Russia was in the Northwest territories up into Alaska, but even on the Pacific Northwestern coast. And then Great Britain just north of us in Canada. So it wasn't as though we were this sort of totally separated from these European nations. I don't see a world in which we did not assert some kind of sovereignty for ourselves or make some kind of declaration. If we had not made that declaration, I don't know. If the United States was continuing to grow as a continental power, I find it hard to believe that we wouldn't have made some sort of claim on the Western Hemisphere in some capacity. It may not have been a Monroe Doctrine. Maybe it would have been I don't know, a Grant or a Roosevelt doctrine, but certainly by the 1890s, when the United States is really becoming a world power, someone would have made some kind of a statement.
Fascinating. Thank you. I love learning about the history. It's so awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary and Janine. And we've got some great audience questions lined up. Kirk, we know you've got to jump off here in about 7 minutes, but if we have time for just a couple of audience questions. Lewis White asks, do you think it was an attempt to say to the other powers that the United States was not looking to conquer the world, only looking to gain or expand locally in the New World?
Yeah, I certainly think so. And it's important to remember too, following Washington's farewell address when he makes the famous proclamation of neutrality, beware of foreign entanglements. That was sort of the tradition of the United States, that we were a power that was focused on ourselves. We didn't want to intervene in other wars, and I think, or other nations' affairs. I think that's both rooted in sort of our smaller Republican sort of ideals, but also in our fear of our skepticism towards the standing army and just our inability to really project power in any meaningful way. It's also important to keep in mind this is the 18th and 19th centuries. We don't have a lot of tools of projecting power very far without a lot of effort. And so I certainly think so. And I certainly think it's the United States making clear that it has no interest becoming involved in the conflicts in Europe that are related to this. So into the 19th century, you have more sort of rebellions that pop up, in 1848, 1830. It's the United States saying that it doesn't have an interest in being involved in those in any sort of political context.
Well, thank you. And one of our teachers actually has a really interesting exercise that he says that he does. And Ben, being a teacher, we also encourage you to check out Bill of Rights Institute, Kirk's organization that does an outstanding job. But Ben says, I do an activity in class where I have students analyze Washington's farewell address, then they analyze the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt Corollary, Truman Doctrine, and the Eisenhower Doctrine. Then they decide how well future presidents followed Washington's advice on neutrality. And in your opinion, how well do these acts follow that advice?
Yeah, I think that's a great activity to do. And again, I think it's an interesting way of looking at how American foreign policy has evolved, and that the debate um, over isolationism, our role in the Western Hemisphere, and when it is that it's in our interest to be involved in different foreign wars has really shaped the story of American foreign policy since the Washington administration. I mean, those questions continue to become central. They're central to debates over the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. They're central following as we expand our role after World War II. And so doing that activity, I think, is a great one to show students sort of that thread, and then to pull on those principles that underline it, which is to say, what is it that is in the direct interest of the United States? When is it that we get involved? How is it these different moments in American history have shaped the understanding of the nation, but also then be borne out as we have these debates in the legislature and with our executive.
Yeah, and it's always great to have the students reading the primary documents. That's really
Absolutely.
great. Valerie Rimley asked, did the Latin American countries and Mexico agree to the Monroe Doctrine? It sounds like it was just between the US and Europe.
Yeah, it was more with the U.S. sort of speaking into the void. So, the U.S. sort of makes the declaration and states that's what it means. Europe, the Latin American nations certainly responded to it in terms of how it is that they thought, how likely it is that they thought that it would mean anything to them. And again, there was skepticism around just the ability for the United States to project any kind of power. But I think to the extent that they were not bothered by it, but it also wasn't a guarantee that the United States would get involved on their behalf. So I don't think it would have been something that they were saying, "Oh, thank goodness this has finally happened." I think it was more, what will this actually mean? What can the United States actually do, and how will they now use this to shape their foreign policy moving forward?
Well, thank you, Kirk. And I know you've got another commitment right at 2:30, so we want to let you go and have a chance to get online for that next appearance. We thank you so much for your time today and your great explanations on the Monroe Doctrine. And just wanted to give you a chance if you have any parting comments. And we want to tell our audience to stay on because we've got another great guest on this subject, and we'll get to more questions in just a little bit. But any last words, Kirk?
No, I'll just say thank you again so much, Kathy, Janine, for having me on, and Mary for your great questions. And Jim, I'm sorry not to be here to see your half of the presentation. So, but I hope everyone enjoys. I'm sure it'll be great.
Well, thank you, Kirk. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
And we now welcome before we do that, we want to thank our sponsors. We want to thank our sponsors. We want to thank Ken and Bernice Reeder of Ohio for once again supporting our constitutional chats today. Ken and Bernice are just wonderful supporters of Constituting America and support, I'd say, probably about 4 or 5 of these chats every year. So, Ken and Bernice, thank you so much for your continued generous Zoom sponsorships of these chats and all you do to help Constituting America deliver our Constitution education programs. And Jewel, we also wanted to remind our audience that today is Giving Tuesday, and we would be grateful for your support because your gifts on Giving Tuesday help us bring the Constitution to life for students through our school speaking program, Clips for Classroom, weekly constitutional chats, winter trips, our contest, our yearly studies of America's founding documents, and our latest very exciting project, The Pursuit, a new film and both documentary and short form docu-series that we are just so excited to be launching soon. So, Jewel, we wanted to, I see you pulled up the website there and you were going to show our Giving Tuesday, how people can give. And so you just click on the big red button at constitutingamerica.org, go right to Giving Tuesday, and help us make our goal. So thank you for showing that, Jewel. And we now welcome our second guest for our segment, Jim Pinkerton. Jim Pinkerton currently serves as a senior fellow in the Center for American Prosperity at the America First Policy Institute. He worked in the Domestic Policy Office and the Political Office at the White House under President Reagan and in President Reagan's 1980 and 1984 presidential campaigns. From 1985 to 1982, he also worked for Vice President George H.W. Bush in his campaigns and in the domestic policy of his White House. In 2008, Jim served as senior advisor to Mike Huckabee's presidential campaign. From 1996 to 2016, Jim was a contributor to the Fox News Channel. He was also a twice-a-week columnist for Newsday, covering everything from presidential elections to the Iraq War. Jim has written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, and today Jim writes regularly for Breitbart, the American Conservative, and the Daily Caller. And he's married to our very own Elizabeth Pinkerton and is a graduate of Stanford University. Jim, welcome to Constitutional Chats, and we'd love to have some opening comments from you. And then once again, we'll go back through with questions from our panel and audience.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and it's nice to be with all of you, Janine and Mary and Jewel and all of you. I agree with everything Kirk said. He said it well. I will just sort of say that there's 3 prisms through which one might think about the Monroe Doctrine, at least. And there's probably more than 3, but the 3 that leap to mind for me are: 1, it was realpolitik, which is a $2 word in diplomacy for sort of a hard-nosed, self-interest, national interest perspective on things. And by that reckoning, realpolitik, the Monroe Doctrine was an expression of what other powerful countries across the world and across history have called a sphere of influence. They simply declare, look, we're big and powerful, and so we assume, whether or not we write it down, that our neighbors, the nearby waters, so on, are kind of our own, lake. I mean, the Romans talked about the Mediterranean Sea as, our lake, our sea. They just owned it. So by that reckoning, the America sort of looked around the globe and said, well, of course, look, Latin America is right there. It's sort of, especially the Caribbean. And Cuba was always a big focus of American attention for reasons I'll get to. So they just say, look, this is our sphere of influence. Now it happened that, the Monroe Doctrine was declared. What you look through it in just reading about this and just brushing up for this session, there were dozens of doctrines, dozens of corollaries, dozens of memos, dozens of declarations of this and that, and so on. And nobody really remembers them, or, except historians, because they were enunciated by other countries that just didn't have the kind of clout that the United States had, or they were just simply follow-ons to the Monroe Doctrine. The reason the Monroe Doctrine still rings 201 years later, 200 is because it was enforced by the United States. It was, as Kirk said, it was kind of a bluff at first, but by the end of the 19th century, with the Spanish-American War, and then building the Panama Canal in the early 20th century, it was clear the United States meant business and had the power to muscle around. You go to the Marine Memorial, here in Arlington, Virginia, and you look at all the battles that the Marines fought, and you see Santo Domingo and Haiti. You see all these, Panama. You see all these places where the U.S. sent forces, way back when, as part of enforcing its power, its realpolitik power. So that's the first prism. The second prism is sort of paradoxical, it's the opposite of realpolitik, which is idealism. Kirk mentioned that the Monroe Doctrine was enunciated at a time when Europe was dominated by, and he mentioned it, the Holy Alliance, which was Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And these were, in those days, arch reactionary, right-wing, royalist, repressive countries. It was the horrors to sort of liberal democracy. They're just seen as the enemy of all that. And so there was a good deal of thinking in America that, well, America stands for freedom. We stand for democracy. We stand for all these good things. And it makes a sharp contrast between what we're doing here in the United States. And there's a great deal of sympathy for Simon Bolivar and all these revolutions that were happening across Latin America. And Bolivar, of course, in turn, was a huge fan of the United States. Bolivar had wanted to be the George Washington of Latin America, and had a vision of all of Latin America being one giant country in the same way that the United States dominates North America. He wanted to have something for South America. It didn't work out that way, and it's kind of tragic for Latin American history. But there was a good deal of sympathy for the success of small R republics in Latin America and the chance for them to flourish out from under European colonial. And anti-colonialism was a steady theme going into the 20th century. You read about World War I and World War II. It was a major push, even as the United States was fighting the Kaiser or Hitler. There was also a significant strain, people like Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State for FDR, saying we should be, these countries that are being colonialized should be set free. They should be, we should be America is we started out being anti-colonial in 1776, and we still mean it. And so that was a big part of the Monroe Doctrine as well. And then the third element, the third prism, is the figure of John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State, who is, much more of a driving force behind the Monroe Doctrine than President Monroe himself. President Monroe was a fine president and everything, but the brains and thinking behind it was John Quincy Adams, who was frankly much smarter and much more intellectual. And then, of course, himself as the future president. And, John Quincy Adams, son of a president as well, so one of the questioners mentioned, George Washington's, farewell address. It is worth keeping in mind that John Quincy Adams, was old enough to remember George Washington and lived through that with his father as president, as serving as George Washington's vice president and successor. John Quincy Adams was the last of what was loosely known as the Federalist Party. And, George Washington himself never really saw himself as sort of being part of a party. But the period from the inauguration of George Washington in 1789 through 1829, when John Quincy Adams was defeated as he sought re-election in 18, losing to Andrew Jackson, that 40-year period was seen as sort of the Federalist period. It was the Federalist Party dominated, American politics, or at least was contending in American politics. And so John Quincy Adams saw himself as a successor and thinker in the same vein as George Washington, which meant that he agreed with Washington on the no entangling alliances. I mean, one of the most famous foreign policy speeches of the 19th century was John Quincy Adams' speech on July 4th, 1821, when he was Secretary of State, when he has the famous phrase, we go abroad not for searching for monsters to destroy. It was a clear statement. We do not want to get involved in European wars, and that was what they really were talking about mostly. And and to this day, that speech still resonates. For example, here in Washington, there's something called the Quincy Institute, and it's clearly named after John Quincy Adams, deliberately, consciously, because it speaks to they would call themselves restrainers, others would call them isolationists. All of you can research them any way you want. They'll certainly be available to come on podcasts like this and so on to say what they say about foreign policy. And they would say, absolutely, we uphold the tradition of John Quincy Adams, who was not, he was an active figure. I mean, we should get credit for, he negotiated a treaty with Spain to get Florida. It's sort of, it's hard to imagine in the same way that the Louisiana Purchase helped make the United States. It's sort of hard to imagine what the United States would be like if Spain still controlled Florida. We probably would have fought a war over, soon enough. But nonetheless, John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, peacefully negotiated the cession of Florida to the United States. And so, again, all these issues that Adams raised and that the Monroe Doctrine speaks to, we're seeing it today. Broadly speaking, the Monroe Doctrine, speaks to the U.S. willingness to assert its power in our hemisphere. We're seeing that now in the Caribbean. All these stories and these news accounts and videos you're watching on TV or on the internet about blowing up narco ships or narco boats and so on. This is champions of the Monroe Doctrine, from Adams to Theodore Roosevelt to Pete Hegseth today, would say this is all in keeping with the natural, obvious national security requirements of the United States to keep a close eye on our backyard. And conversely, the same people who tend to emphasize, the importance of policing drugs in the Caribbean and Latin America and dealing with Venezuela, whatever happens with Venezuela, tend to be hostile to interventions further away. And so there's the same people, including the Quincy Institute, who would say, we should be, keeping track of drug cartels in our hemisphere, would then say we shouldn't be defending Taiwan, we shouldn't be worried about Ukraine. And this is a hot, ongoing debate now. You open up, I'm showing my age when I say open up a newspaper. Kids might not even recognize those things. You turn on your screen and you'll see tons and tons of stories about figures such as Elbridge Colbrey, who's the Undersecretary of Defense, talking giving heavy, thoughtful speeches about why Ukraine is less important or Taiwan is more important, or just back and forth and back and forth. And I think it all really kind of radiates from the thinking that John Quincy Adams laid out in addition to the Monroe Doctrine from 2 centuries ago.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you brought up John Quincy Adams. That it was a really, he had such an important part to play in the Monroe Doctrine. And Janine, I'm going to go back to you for questions.
Great. Yes, we love John Quincy Adams. He's underestimated. He was quite towering. I can say it. Towering. He was quite a towering figure, bigger than life. Okay, well, you've touched on this, but I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this show is because it's in the news what President Trump is the anticipation of what's getting ready to happen in Venezuela. So, the Monroe Doctrine is just something where we just kind of claim in our backyard that don't mess with us kind of speak, don't come into our playbox, our sandbox. How does this Monroe Doctrine fit into what's happening in Venezuela, what may get ready to happen in Venezuela? I think that's the big question and the reason we wanted to do this show. So if you touched on it, but perhaps you can elaborate that a little more, because there are so many more dynamics today about, um, international law, war laws. It's just much bigger than the Monroe Doctrine, but is that sort of the foundation on which, I mean, also you could throw out the Monroe Doctrine, I would think, in this instance, and just say President Trump is trying to protect Americans from this these drugs that are coming across and killing our people. So what are your thoughts about how much the Monroe Doctrine puts into play, plays into this decision?
You're right. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, really, every powerful country has had something akin to the Monroe Doctrine. They might not have called it that. Obviously, they didn't call it that. They called it something else, or they might not even articulate it at all. It was just understood that, England was going to track Ireland. France was going to worry about Belgium. Russia was going to worry about Poland. Whatever they called it. And again, if we were scholars, we could look it up and we'd see that they probably had just a robust literature about why it was important for China to keep track of Mongolia or so on, or Vietnam and so on. But you're right, there are a lot of dynamics we haven't touched on yet, and it's such a rich topic. The big one is Congress. The Monroe Doctrine was propounded by the executive branch 2 centuries ago, and there's tons and tons of Senate Foreign Relations and House Foreign Relations, chairmen and others, appropriators and so on, who had a hand in all this over time. And it is now a serious question. I mean, to take the two somewhat related issues of narco boats and getting blown up in the Caribbean, which is all over the news. It's probably the hottest story coming out of Washington right now. And then also Venezuela, the fate of the Maduro regime and so on. And both are uncertain. I mean, and it's not our place here to pick which one we like or don't like. It's just to say that we're seeing a conscious effort by Congress. Senator Wicker, who's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and his name is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, whose name escapes me at this exact moment. He's from Alabama. Mike Rogers. These are figures who, they're Republicans. They are, pro-Trump. They're not rabble rousers, but they're obviously concerned, and they have the Democrat, Senator Reed of Rhode Island, Democrat, working with Senator Wicker, and Congressman Smith of Washington State, working with the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Armed Services Committee. These people are very, very conscious of what's going on. They want to know. They want to have hearings. And we'll see. I mean, we're just at the beginning of sorting through this chapter 1,000,000 in the endless saga of Article 1 versus Article 2 on presidential powers. And Gene, you touched on or alluded to the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was an attempt back in 1973 to clarify the terms under which a president could go to war. Again, simply say go to war. I mean, the United States hasn't issued a formal declaration of war since 1941, and we've been to war 50 times since, in one time or another. And there's room in the Constitution, there's room in sort of understanding of American foreign policy. Sometimes the president has to act immediately to do something, to deal with a pirate or a sneak attack or something. But then there's also just these larger questions of, does the president have to go to Congress to get authority for these things? And certainly the Venezuela thing, to the extent that any possible American action in Venezuela involves, regime change or anything like that. And I'm not speaking for anything. I'm just speculating on what others have been, discussing, including members of Congress saying we should overthrow the Maduro regime. They're not necessarily in charge of anything, but they're certainly voices. The Constitution is, pretty explicit. Anything like that, you'd have to go to Congress and get permission, as did, for example, George W. Bush back in 2002 on the Iraq War.
Okay, we'll toss because my time's up, or I'd ask more questions. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Always good to see you.
Mary, we'll go to you.
Hi, Mr. Pinkerton. I'm glad to talk to you. I just have a couple questions. When I was listening to you, the big theme I hear a lot is the idea behind the Monroe Doctrine, keeping enemies out of our backyard or preserving our backyard. But I see a possibility of the flip side of that being if we have issues in the region because of our enforcement, there could be issues in our backyard which would be more dangerous. Can you speak to that in any way?
Well, I mean, the idea of drugs, and if you research the drug issue, you read about cocaine, and you read about fentanyl, you read obviously marijuana. I mean, that this is the whole notion that there is a drug epidemic in the United States, and tens of thousands of people a year dying of overdoses. So it's a terrible situation. You read, you mentioned foreign policy books. You read, Hans Morgenthau's classic textbook, from the 40s and 50s, and there's not a mention of drugs in there. It just doesn't occur to anybody back then. They were talking about the Soviet Union and, Hitler and so on. And the idea that there's a drug issue sneaking in on us like that, it's new territory. And so, inside the federal government, there's been sort of a what they would call a turf war, and it's nonviolent, bureaucratic, jockeying around between the Coast Guard, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and now the Pentagon, now the military, now SOCOM, the Special Operations Command. I mean, this is, who's got the lead on dealing with drugs. And then don't forget the Border Patrol and ICE and all these agencies, because if you think of the drug issue as imported from Mexico, that's one thing. If you think of the drug issue as ships coming across the Caribbean, that's the third, that's the second. And as a third, what happens with chemicals coming from China? The fentanyl thing appears to be substantially, not so much fentanyl itself, but components of fentanyl coming across, and how do you deal with that? So these are issues, that policymakers have to wrestle with, and fair to say they haven't done a particularly good job in terms of the amount of drugs in this country, which leads to the kind of strong reaction, that Hegseth and the Pentagon are dealing with now. It's and if you, then you get past drugs, you say, okay, what else is coming along that is a danger to the United States of a kind of sneaky manner? And, it's not an army or an air force. It's things like cyber attacks, right? And, hacking and intellectual property theft and so on. I mean, these are issues, the United States government has struggled to, get a handle on all those issues, mostly dealing with China on these. It's it's very much in flux, that's for sure. And sooner or later, somebody will come up with, all right, there's, you read about the Monroe Doctrine, various corollaries and so on. Somebody's gonna have to come up with a new corollary or something that describes exactly the issues you're mentioning. And okay, so the statesman or stateswoman X is now saying we have a new way of thinking about how to stop X, Y, or Z from, coming across the border. And it's a new definition of national security.
Yeah, and I mean, when I'm looking into it, you're right. The preservation efforts, especially with drugs, I think it is a new issue too. So it's probably contributing to why it's not been effective, but it doesn't look like it's been too effective. And we seem to have mixed results with keeping people out. So I know when we approach foreign policy, some people approach it like domestic policy and they want to get rid of stuff that they think doesn't work. But I feel like there would be consequences as I'm sorry, was it Mr. Ringley that was speaking previously? He was talking about how this was important to establish us as a power. So is this something that's just important in its presence, but not necessarily effective in enforcement? Or what do you think about that?
Well, look, plenty of people say we're fighting a drug war and the drugs are winning, we're losing, we can't win, so well, maybe, I'm not sure I agree. I'm perfectly happy to fight the drug war. And again, it is a great example of an issue that just bleeds between domestic and foreign, because somebody will say, listen, you can stop all the interdiction you want, but if people want to take drugs here and there's a demand for it, they'll still find a way. I'm not so, I think they used to say that about the wall, building a wall across the southern border and say, well, they still come anyway. No, they won't. If you build a wall, they won't come. If you stop drugs from coming in, they won't be here. There is this phenomenon of domestic production, including legal domestic production, that gets repurposed. It's all these issues concerning Purdue Pharma over the last 20 years. All these OxyContin pills were produced perfectly legally, and nobody had any idea, they could get hijacked the way they were to be, on the black market and so on. And then there's, things like epiphedrine and so on. I mean, all these, creative, imaginative chemists are always figuring out a way to, as it were, hack some consumer product and get some psychedelic, substance out of it. Again, where does this now we really are kind of in domestic policy. But what's notable about this administration is they are saying, I mean, look at what is coming out of the Pentagon now, for better or worse, whether you like it or not. Secretary Hegseth has said, stopping drugs from coming into the United States is as important as stopping the Russians from attacking Ukraine or Chinese from attacking Taiwan. I mean, it is a definite shift in priorities from this administration to the previous one, and the American people will have to make a judgment on it.
Thank you, Mr. Pinkerton. I loved our conversation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Janine. And Jim, we've got some great audience questions lined up. Before we go to the audience questions, we want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas on Las Vegas's KKVV, 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone in Las Vegas who's listening. And Jim, we will start with Dr. Eric Braverman, who asks, please discuss the intersection of the Monroe Doctrine and the manifest destiny concept.
Well, I mean, manifest destiny is, it was a phrase, I think, first used by the American journalist John O'Sullivan in, 1837, give or take. There's several John O'Sullivans in American history, including a contemporary one, but this guy goes way back. The manifest out in the same way that the Monroe Doctrine was a fancy way of saying a great power is going to assert itself in its neighborhood. Manifest destiny is a fancy way of saying that if there are a lot of people, with guns and energy on the East Coast and they want to move west and go all the way to California, they will. Then manifest destiny simply spoke to the sort of energy and exuberance of pioneers and people who wanted to build railroads, and also a heavy emphasis on the strategicness of, per the Monroe Doctrine, we didn't want the Russians at first in the early 19th century, and then later the French or the British or the Japanese or the Germans. We didn't want them to colonize California. We didn't want to see some great power on our own continent. And so we figured quite rightly, we better get there first. And so this was the impetus behind, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the great triumphs of American political engineering, to get that railroad connecting the East Coast and California. I guess it was finally finished in, I think, 1869. But it was just imperative militarily for this. So between military needs of strategy, just the population growing, and people looking for gold and oil and whatever else, free land, whatever it was that they wanted, the manifest destiny just became sort of the obvious thing that the United States was going to do. And it's worth keeping in mind. I mean, it's just interesting to note that plenty of people, including Senator Beveridge of Indiana, saw a manifest destiny extending itself to the Philippines, past Hawaii. Hawaii obviously was included in it, but past Hawaii to the Philippines, to Cuba, and at one time or another to various other islands in the Caribbean, many of which we still possess. Puerto Rico, most obviously, the American Virgin Islands. Some of these Central American countries as well. We had what they used to call filibusterers would go down there and try and carve out a little kingdom, and there's still Americans. There's a investment place in El Salvador or Honduras, which is some sort of enterprise zone city created by sort of high tech types in California and so on. So there's still a version of manifest, and of course Elon Musk will say manifest destiny will take him to space and so on. And frankly, I'm all for it. It's just what countries do. You need room to expand and grow and find the resources and use them. So Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, both are both, MDs, aren't they? Both the same initials. I think they're both great ideas.
Well, thank you. And Richard MacArthur and Robert Spiegler both have questions about at the time of the Monroe Doctrine on support from both Britain, Great Britain, and then the French. And Richard asks, was British support of the Monroe Doctrine essential to its early success?
Well, I don't. Kirk might disagree. I don't think the British particularly supported it. What they were very conscious of is they didn't want some other country
Mm.
to get the edge by coming back. And
Mhm.
and so, look, I mean, at one time or another, the French, as Kirk mentioned, the French, when we were distracted by the Civil War, they tried to sort of, as it were, conquer Mexico. And it's a safe bet that in the 19th century, if they'd been able to, great powers like most notably France, England, and Germany, Prussia, then Germany, would have loved to absorb South America, just as they did Africa, for example, or big pieces of China. So I think the British were more, look, the British didn't really take us seriously as a country until, we won the Spanish-American War in 1898. That was when we really kind of, established ourselves out there. And so, again, as we've discussed, back in the early 19th century, when Secretary Adams and President Monroe talked about it, it was kind of a bluff. It was just sort of a statement that wouldn't have otherwise, might not have ever even made the history books, had it not been for the way the United States turned out. And so the British kind of played along with it, even as they would have said at the time the Monroe Doctrine was written, there is one great power in the world, and that's England, that's Britain. It's our Navy that takes you everywhere. And so our Navy, and they weren't really wrong at that time. They sort of defeated us in the Naval War of 1812. It was our Navy enforcing it. And so if the Americans are kind of saying what they're saying, well, let them say that, but only 75 years later, they realize, wow, the Americans aren't kidding around on this.
Well, thank you, Jim. And that's a great way to close. We are so appreciative of you being on today and your expertise and all you bring to our podcast. We always love having you as a guest. And Mary, thank you so much. It's so great to have you back. And Janine and Jewel, thank you. And thank you to our audience for all your great questions. And we want to invite everyone to come back next week. We're going to be talking about the Chinese government's purchase of much of our land here in the United States. What's been going on over the past few years with that, and what our country is doing now, and maybe planning on doing in the future about it, and any constitutional issues related to that. So I think Stephen Yates is going to be our guest. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, December 9th.
Thank you.
Bye.